I watched from my car as my son lied under oath, erasing my name. The store he stole from me still had my fingerprints on every beam. He thought the will was lost. Thought I'd gone quietly. But I still held the keys. The deeds, the truth. They said I was dead to them. So I rose and made them choke on what they tried to bury. Wait. Before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Marianne Elwood sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread flat beneath her palm. Her husband's obituary stared back with cold finality. The bold print confirmed what she already knew in her bones. Harold Elwood was gone. What hollowed her out wasn't the death itself. She had sat by his side through years of creaking joints, failing memory, and quiet decline. No, the knife came from the words beneath his name. Survived by his son Brian Elwood and daughter-in-law Sabrina Elwood, his only family. Only family. Her tea had gone cold hours ago. The house was still, save for the rain tapping at the kitchen window, steady as a clock. She traced the edge of the obituary with a fingertip, forcing her breath into even rhythm. Grief was private. Rage could wait. The live stream of the funeral played on her laptop, muted at first. She hadn't been invited, hadn't even been told. A neighbor mentioned seeing the notice in the paper, and that was how she discovered her husband had been laid into the ground. With a flick of her wrist, she turned on the sound. The camera wavered in the gray drizzle of the Salem cemetery. Folding chairs lined the muddy ground. A black umbrella shifted, revealing her son. Brian wore a tailored suit, chin stiff, expression bored even as the minister spoke. Beside him sat Sabrina, back straight, mouth set into something resembling grief but laced with smugness. When Sabrina stood to give a eulogy, Marianne's hand curled into a fist on the table. Harold believed in fresh starts, Sabrina said, her voice cutting through the static of the live stream. He believed in letting go of old burdens. And his family will honor that. A few polite nods followed, but Marianne heard the venom beneath the sweetness. A fresh start meant without her. The screen flickered as rain distorted the lens. Marianne did not cry. Her eyes were dry, fixed, unreadable. She shut the laptop when the coffin began its slow descent. The sound of dirt hitting wood didn't need to echo in her kitchen. Hours later, the knock on her door came soft but insistent. She knew the rhythm before she rose to answer it. Margot Pierce, her childhood friend, and the only person she trusted without question, stepped in carrying a thermos of chamomile tea. Her coat dripped rain onto the entry rug. "They didn't even call you," Margot muttered, setting the thermos on the counter with a thud. "Not a phone call. Not a word. Bastards." Marianne poured 2 cups, the steam rising in pale curls. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table that had seen decades of laughter, arguments, bills spread out, and birthdays sung off key. Tonight it held silence thick enough to choke on. "Did you watch?" Margot finally asked. "I watched," Marianne replied evenly. Her voice gave nothing away. Margot's hands trembled as she wrapped them around her cup. If Harold could see what they did, he saw plenty while he was alive. Marianne cut in. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. He knew what Brian was becoming. He just never wanted to admit it out loud. The rain grew heavier outside, rattling the gutters, drumming against the kitchen window. Margot shook her head. "They've written you out like you never existed. As if decades of your work meant nothing." Marianne sipped her tea, eyes drifting toward the far corner of the room. The old oak hutch stood there, its drawer barely noticeable, blending with the grain. She rose quietly, crossed the room, and slid it open. Inside lay a ring of keys, heavy and tarnished from age. Each one was different: brass, steel, one with a jagged tooth. Harold had once called temperamental. Marianne held them in her palm, the metal cold against her skin. Margot watched her, curiosity flickering. "You've kept those all this time." "Of course," Marianne said simply. Without another word she moved to the hallway. Her slippers made no sound on the wood floor. At the end of the hall, behind coats that hadn't been worn in years, was a small wall safe. She knelt, her hands steady, as she fitted one of the keys into the lock. The click echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The door swung open. Inside, wrapped in yellowing envelopes and stiff folders, were papers that had not seen daylight in decades. Property deeds, contracts, originals signed in ink, notarized, dated, her name Marianne Elwood, etched on every one. Not Brian's, not Sabrina's, hers alone. The glow from the hallway light caught her face as she stared at them. No smile, no tears. Just the stillness of someone who had been underestimated for too long. Behind her, Margot whispered, "What exactly are those?" Marianne didn't answer. She ran her hand over the top deed, as though confirming it was real, her wedding band catching on the paper's edge. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Oregon sky, shaking the glass in its frame. Inside, the safe yawned open, its secrets no longer buried. Marianne slowed her car as she turned down Ash Grove Lane, the neighborhood street where her life had once been stitched into every flower bed, every late-night porch light, every argument muffled behind closed blinds. The Elwood house rose up in the drizzle, its paint chipped and gutters sagging. A new sign stood crooked in the lawn. For sale. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. They hadn't wasted a month. Out front, Brian's voice sliced through the damp air. "You didn't mention this in the disclosures," he snapped, pacing in the gravel driveway. His suit jacket clung to him, soaked at the shoulders. Across from him, a realtor in a navy raincoat held her ground, clipboard pressed to her chest. "There are legal claims attached to the property," the realtor explained, tone sharp with practiced patience. "They're public record. Those are ancient." Brian barked, red blotches creeping up his neck. "They shouldn't even count." Marianne rolled past, her eyes flicking to the porch. The light above the front door sputtered twice, then steadied into its faint, stubborn glow. She had rewired that fixture herself in the late 80s, crouched on a step stool while Harold swore at tangled wires. She hadn't been back inside in years, but the house still carried her mark. She pulled over at the corner and cracked open a leather-bound journal balanced on the passenger seat. The rain tapped a restless rhythm on the roof as she wrote in neat, deliberate strokes. Porch light still flickers. House listed without clear title. Brian rattled. Her pen paused. She underlined rattled twice. The diner was warm, smelling of burnt coffee and fryer oil. Marianne sat in a corner booth, her journal tucked beside her. Reggie Lane slid in across from her, his flannel shirt damp from the rain. At 30, he still carried that boyish loyalty she remembered from the day she had spoken to a landlord on his family's behalf and kept a roof over their heads. He glanced at the folded paper she pushed across the table. "What's this?" "A list," Marianne said. Her tone left no room for argument. Reggie scanned it. Addresses, storage units, lock changes, names of vendors. "You've been planning this a long time." Marianne lifted her coffee, letting the steam warm her face. "They thought throwing me out meant erasing me, but they forgot. I built half of what they're standing on." Reggie leaned back, jaw tightening. "So where do we start?" She closed her journal with a soft snap. "We start with the locks." The rain had eased into mist by the time Brian's temper reached the marble counter at the Marion County Records Office. His tie was crooked now, his hair damp from running through the parking lot. The clerk behind the desk tapped patiently at her keyboard, while he loomed, voice echoing through the nearly empty hall. "This lien was filed in error." Brian insisted, his words fast, frantic. "Remove it." The clerk adjusted her glasses and turned the monitor slightly. "The lien was filed correctly, sir. Property ownership remains under Marianne Elwood, legal and current." Brian blinked, the color draining from his face. The clerk's tone was firm, almost pitying. "She never signed it away." The hallway lights buzzed overhead, the smell of floor polish sharp in the air. For the first time in years, Brian realized his mother's name was still stitched into the bones of every title he thought he owned. And Marianne, miles away, sat in her car outside the diner, her journal open to a fresh page, the ink waiting. The rain hadn't stopped when Marianne stepped into Tobias Rain's office. The faint scent of polished oak and paper ink greeted her, a contrast to the damp streets outside. His office sat on the third floor of an old brick building overlooking downtown Salem. Everything about the space was precise. Rows of casebooks aligned like soldiers, framed certificates, leveled to perfection, blinds pulled exactly halfway. Tobias rose from behind his mahogany desk, his expression steady. He was a man who never wasted words, and Marianne respected him for that. She placed a thick manila envelope in front of him with quiet authority. "These," she said. Tobias slid on his glasses and opened the envelope. His fingers spread the documents carefully. One by one, the original co-ownership contracts for Elwood Hardware, 3 rental properties, and the notarized partnership agreements that bore her signature in ink untouched by time. "Originals," Tobias murmured, tracing the embossed notary seals. His brow furrowed. Where were these kept? Marianne's gaze didn't flicker. Safe place. He studied her a moment longer, then returned to the papers. The office was silent except for the scratch of his pen as he made quick notes on a yellow legal pad. After several minutes, Tobias opened his laptop and navigated the county property database. He pulled up scanned records for Elwood Hardware. At first, everything looked standard. Then he leaned closer, his jaw tightening. "There," he tapped the screen. "A resignation letter from you, supposedly dated 2014. Conveniently filed the same month Brian assumed full control." Marianne leaned forward. The digital copy bore her name in clumsy cursive. She didn't blink. "I never wrote that." "I know," Tobias said, already reaching for a file folder from his cabinet. He flipped through until he found a blank affidavit. "We'll need to swear it under oath." Without hesitation, Marianne slid another paper from her envelope. This one was notarized, dated that same year, proof that she had attended a property signing in Portland on the very day she supposedly resigned. The notary's embossed seal shimmered faintly under Tobias's desk lamp. His lips curved. Not quite a smile, but close. Beautiful, ironclad. The office door creaked, and Margot slipped in, shaking rain from her umbrella. She carried a folder tucked under her arm, the Salem Public Library stamp still visible on its cover. "I thought you'd want this," she said, sliding it across Tobias's desk. Inside were yellowed news clippings, articles from the late 70s announcing the grand opening of Elwood Hardware. A photograph showed Harold and Marianne cutting the ribbon together, her name listed first beneath the headline, "Co-founders launch family store." Margot folded her arms, satisfaction sharp in her eyes. "They can rewrite ledgers all they want. The ink on these pages doesn't lie." Tobias scanned the clippings, then sat back in his chair. He tapped his pen against the desk. "This isn't just sloppy forgery, it's deliberate fraud. We'll file for injunctions against transfer of all properties, effective immediately." He reached for another form, his handwriting quick and deliberate. "Brian and Sabrina will be served within days. That resignation letter won't just collapse, it'll boomerang." Marianne sat with her hands folded in her lap, steady as stone. She didn't gloat, she didn't rage. She simply watched as years of quiet preservation unfolded into power. Margot's voice broke the silence. "They'll know it's you." "They already know," Marianne replied softly. Tobias slid the documents into a fresh file and closed it with a snap, his eyes fixed on Marianne. "This will escalate fast. The kind of fraud they committed. Once it's in the courts, it doesn't stop until everything is dragged into the light. Are you ready for that?" The rain battered the window harder, as if punctuating the question. Marianne met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was calm, almost serene. "I've been ready for years." The morning the papers were served, Elwood Hardware smelled of sawdust and old oil. Customers browsed aisles lined with loose screws and rust-stained hammers. Behind the counter, Brian tried to look composed, but his foot tapped against the floor with impatient rhythm. The glass door swung open, and a man in a dark suit entered, briefcase in hand. He moved with the crisp certainty of someone who knew every eye was on him. He approached Brian without hesitation and handed him a thick envelope. "For you, Mr. Elwood." Brian tore it open, his face flushing crimson as he read. Sabrina appeared from the office and back, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What's that?" "Court injunction," Brian muttered, the veins in his temple pulsing. Sabrina snatched the papers, flipping through them. Her lips curled into a sneer. "This is a pathetic stunt. Your mother can't touch us." The room fell silent. A clerk at the register pretended to rearrange receipts, avoiding eye contact. A customer dropped a package of nails back on the shelf and slipped out quietly. Outside, Salem's morning rain had settled into a mist that clung to the windows. Mary Ann sat in her car across the street, watching. Her face gave nothing away. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a folder, methodically reviewing checklists. On the top page, a column of boxes had been ticked with precision. One remained unchecked. She dialed her broker from a prepaid cell. "Pull everything," she said. "Now, by 11 a.m. The power inside Elwood Hardware flickered once, twice, then died. The fluorescent hum vanished. Customers grumbled. Sabrina cursed under her breath and barked at Brian to check the breaker box. But no amount of flipping switches could bring the lights back on. Across town, Reggie Lane stood in front of a row of metal storage units, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He held a new set of keys, freshly cut. The court order in his pocket gave him full authority. The previous locks lay discarded at his feet, each one severed with clean precision. He pulled the doors open one by one, the metallic screech echoing through the lot. Inside, boxes of hardware, paint and lumber bore Elwood's name, assets Mary Ann now controlled. He pocketed the keys, his jaw set with grim loyalty. Meanwhile, in the quiet corner of Salem's public library, Margot Pierce slid a manila envelope across a table to a reporter from the Statesman Journal. The reporter's pen hovered, his eyebrows rising as he skimmed through photocopied clippings and notarized filings. "Are you sure this is solid?" he asked. Margot smirked, her voice low and firm. "It's more than solid. It's airtight, and the public deserves to know what Brian and Sabrina have been pulling." Back downtown, the courthouse cafe smelled of burnt espresso and lemon cleaner. Mary Ann sat at a corner table, stirring her coffee with calm, deliberate movement. She wore her raincoat neatly buttoned, her hair pinned with the same precision as her handwriting. People coming and going through the courthouse entrance across the street glanced toward her, whispering, recognizing the woman who had once vanished from public view, but now sat visible, unbothered, untouchable. She didn't flinch when Sabrina stormed past the cafe window minutes later, shouting into her phone, her gestures sharp enough to cut air. Mary Ann took a sip of coffee, eyes steady, as if she were merely observing the weather. By mid-afternoon, the storm broke not in the sky, but at the hardware store. A white city van pulled up, its logo stenciled on the side. City of Salem, Building and Safety Department. A man in a reflective jacket and clipboard stepped out, his boots splashing in the puddles. He entered through the front doors, shaking rain from his shoulders. "Inspection order," he announced. Brian stared at him, frozen. "What inspection?" The inspector lifted the paper clipped to his clipboard. "Anonymous request. Claims of unsafe wiring, improper storage, and unreported renovations." Sabrina's jaw dropped. "Anonymous," she hissed, but her eyes darted toward the cafe across the street. There, through the rain-streaked glass, Mary Ann sat perfectly still, sipping her coffee as though nothing at all were happening. The ledger lay open on Tobias Rain's desk, its spine cracked, pages smelling of mildew and ink. He had been paging through it for nearly an hour, his finger running along rows of entries that should have told a clean story of sales and expenses. Instead, he kept circling dates, his pen tapping against the margins. Finally, he closed the book with a decisive thud. "They forged you, Marianne." She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unflinching. "Show me." Tobias flipped it back open, pointing to 3 separate entries. Each bore her name in a shaky scrawl, signatures supposedly authorizing major withdrawals from the business account. The dates matched years when Marianne had deliberately stepped back from store operations. Her voice was steady. I wasn't even in Salem those weeks. From her bag, she pulled a slim envelope and slid it across the desk. Inside were stamped receipts and a certificate from a horticulture seminar she had attended in Seattle, along with dated hotel records. She tapped one page. I was 200 miles away. Tobias's mouth curved into a sharp smile. Perfect. We'll shred this forgery in court. The office door cracked open, and Margot stepped in without knocking. She dropped a stack of photocopies onto the desk, her librarian's precision visible in every neatly labeled tab. You'll want to see these. Tobias scanned the pages. They were notes, hand-scrawled lists of figures and reminders. Sign her name here. Adjust dates and ledger must match deposits. The handwriting slanted aggressively to the right, letters sharp and hurried. Margot leaned against the wall, arms folded. I compared them with forms Sabrina filed at City Hall last year. Same hand, same pressure point. She didn't even try to disguise it. The room went still. Tobias tapped the notes with the back of his pen. This isn't just fraud. This is criminal intent. He began drafting a motion with surgical efficiency, his fountain pen scratching across the paper. We'll file for fraud charges, and I'll prepare referrals to the district attorney. This ledger will bury them. Reggie entered quietly, rain still clinging to his jacket. He carried a sworn affidavit, the notary stamp fresh at the bottom. He set it on Tobias's desk. I saw her, Reggie said simply. Sabrina pulled the ledger out in the back office one night. She had correction fluid, fresh ink pens, and she kept muttering about dates. I knew it wasn't right, so I wrote it all down. Tobias tucked the affidavit into the growing file. Between the forged signatures, the handwriting evidence and this affidavit, we're locked in. They can't wriggle out. That afternoon, Marianne walked out of a downtown bank branch, just as Brian stormed up the sidewalk, his tie loose, his face blotchy with rage. You think this is funny? He spat, blocking her path. Dragging our family name through the mud? You'll ruin everything. The wind carried the smell of wet pavement and exhaust. Marianne regarded him with the stillness of stone. Then she stepped sideways, walking past without a word, her heels striking the concrete like a metronome. Brian's voice cracked as he shouted after her, but she didn't turn. She was already gone, like a ghost drifting through a body that no longer mattered. Later that week, Tobias's phone buzzed. He read the email twice before dialing Marianne directly. A developer just filed suit against Brian, he said. He tried to sell land he doesn't own, land that legally belongs to you. For the first time, Marianne allowed herself a small, cold smile. Then let them find out who the land really belongs to. The storm had only just begun. The conference room at Elwood Hardware smelled faintly of varnish and stale coffee when the developer arrived. He wore an immaculate gray suit, his umbrella dripping rainwater into the entry mat. He didn't sit. He slapped a thick folder down on Brian's desk, the pages fanning out like cards in a dealer's hand. You sold me land that doesn't belong to you, the man said flatly. Brian's face went pale. That's not true. It's in your contract. The developer cut him off, stabbing a finger at the highlighted clauses. You signed assurances that you had full legal ownership, but records show the title is still tied to Marianne Elwood. You don't own it. And unless you want this escalated to court tomorrow morning, you're refunding every cent plus damages. The rain beat harder against the windows, each drop hammering Brian's skull like a gavel. Sabrina hovered in the corner, arms crossed, her jaw tight. We'll fix this, she said smoothly. But her voice wavered. It's just a clerical error. The developer snapped his folder shut. You'll fix it in court. Then he was gone, leaving silence thick as wet cement. Brian gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. I'll mortgage the house. Cover it until this blows over. By the next morning, he was sitting in a sterile bank office, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. The loan officer scanned his application with professional detachment. Mr. Elwood, she said, sliding the paperwork back toward him. "We can't approve this. The deed shows joint ownership. Marianne Elwood's signature is required." Brian's chest tightened. "That's impossible. She hasn't lived there in years." "Doesn't matter," the officer said. "Standing, she's still on title. Without her consent, this mortgage goes nowhere." Across town, Tobias sipped his black coffee as he read the alert from the bank's counsel. A quiet satisfaction crept into his features. He placed the call to Marianne. "They tried to mortgage the house," he said. "I blocked it. They're boxed in tighter than they realize." Marianne, standing by her kitchen window with rain streaking the glass, replied evenly, "Good. Let them choke on the walls they built." But Sabrina wasn't ready to choke. That evening, under the buzz of a single lamp in the hardware store office, she hunched over papers with a pen gripped too tightly. The air smelled of ink and her own sour sweat. She scrawled Marianne's name again and again on forms she thought no one would scrutinize. Her handwriting grew frantic, the loops uneven. She whispered to herself, "It just has to look real long enough." But even as she wrote, her hands shook. She knew the edges of her lies were fraying. The next day, Salem's small-town press began buzzing. A slim column in the Statesman Journal appeared under the business section, "Developer accuses local store of fraudulent land sale." The article was unsigned, attributed only to staff reports, but Margot recognized her phrasing in the careful lines. She'd leaked it with quiet precision, ensuring the story spread without leading back to Marianne. By noon, customers were whispering in the aisles. The Elwood name, once a steady pillar, was now paired with fraud, scandal, and deceit. Meanwhile, Reggie strode through the hardware store, with a stack of legal papers tucked under his arm. His boots left damp marks on the linoleum, as he handed the court order to the bewildered clerk at the counter. "These assets are frozen," he said simply. "Nothing leaves this store until further notice." The clerk nodded nervously. Reggie walked out, the rain swallowing him like a shadow. Back in her kitchen, Marianne closed her journal after recording the day's events. The quiet was broken only by the hum of her refrigerator and the distant hiss of rainfall. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message glowed across the screen, from Sabrina Elwood. "You're going to regret this." Marianne stared at it for a long moment, her reflection faint in the glass. Then she placed the phone face down, her lips pressed into something not quite a smile. The war had just turned personal. The courthouse archive smelled of dust and aging paper, the kind that clung to skin and never washed out. Marianne's fingers traced along the spines of labeled boxes until she reached the one she'd been searching for. Elwood Hardware, Founding Records. Her pulse didn't quicken, her hands didn't tremble. She simply lifted the folder free, slid it onto the wooden table, and opened it beneath the flickering fluorescent light. There it was, the original founding document, yellowed with time but still sharp in ink. First name listed, Marianne Elwood. Second, Harold Elwood. No Brian, no Sabrina. Her eyes scanned the page once more before she folded it closed, slipping it into her leather case as if it were nothing more than a grocery receipt. But as she walked out into the drizzle of the courthouse steps, her chest carried a weightless certainty. They had tried to bury her existence. She had just dug it back up. The next morning, Marianne entered Salem City Hall, the smell of wet coats and copier toner thick in the lobby. She approached the clerk's counter and set down the founding document along with notarized forms Tobias had drafted. "I'd like the legal signage and tax identification updated to reflect the original ownership," she said calmly. The clerk skimmed the papers, eyes widening slightly before nodding. "Of course, Mrs. Elwood. It will take a few days for processing." Behind her, a sharp voice sliced through the murmur of the lobby. "Absolutely not." Sabrina stormed forward, her heels striking the tile like gunfire. "This is a scam," she shrieked, waving manicured fingers at the documents. "That store belongs to us. She has no right." The clerk stiffened. "Ma'am, please." Sabrina lunged toward the counter, but two security officers were already moving. They took her by the arms, firm but polite, steering her toward the glass doors as she kicked and cursed. "You'll regret this, old woman," she screamed, her voice echoing through the atrium until the rain outside swallowed her. Marianne hadn't flinched once. She adjusted the strap of her bag, gave the clerk a polite nod, and left as though nothing unusual had happened. That afternoon, Margot went about her work quietly but effectively. At the downtown coffee shop, she leaned across the counter to speak to the owner, sliding a folded article across the register. "Might be smart to review who you're contracting with these days," she said, her tone measured. Later at the auto parts store, she chatted with the manager, mentioning the audit at Elwood Hardware, and letting her words hang heavy in the air. One by one, the subtle conversations spread, and by dusk 3 contracts had already been rerouted away from Brian's control. Marianne didn't need to make calls herself. The town's small business community had long memories. It only took one whisper of her name, backed by Margot's quiet insistence, for loyalties to begin shifting. The following week, Marianne stood at the counter of the state licensing office, her paperwork neatly stamped and filed. When the clerk handed her the freshly activated business license, her name printed boldly across the top, Marianne took it with steady hands. The license smelled faintly of new ink, warm from the printer. She slid it into her journal and buttoned her coat. Outside, the Oregon sky was low and heavy with rain, but for the first time in months, she felt the weight tilting in her favor. That evening, Tobias sat in his office, reviewing the latest filings when his phone buzzed. He read the notification, his brow tightening, then called Marianne immediately. "They filed suit," he said, voice clipped. "Brian and Sabrina are claiming emotional distress. They're demanding damages." Marianne listened without interruption, her silence stretched until Tobias finally asked, "Well, what do you think?" Through the phone, her voice came cold and measured, like the edge of a blade. "I think they just picked the wrong battlefield." The courtroom smelled faintly of rain-soaked coats and polished oak. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, buzzing like faint insects as Sabrina took the witness stand. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, her mascara smudging artfully beneath lashes. "My husband and I," she began, her voice quivering in a way too practiced, "have suffered unimaginable pain because of Marianne Elwood's vindictive actions. She's tried to destroy our reputation, our livelihood, even our family." Her sobs filled the room, echoing off the high ceiling. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. One coughed. From the defense table, Marianne sat in stillness. She didn't glance at the judge, the jury, or even Tobias beside her. She kept her eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table before her, unbothered by Sabrina's performance. When Tobias rose for cross-examination, his movements were slow, deliberate, almost casual. He approached the stand with a single manila folder, flipping it open as though he were reviewing a grocery list. "Mrs. Elwood," he said coolly, "you've told this court you and your husband have been harassed, correct?" "Yes," Sabrina sniffled, clutching her tissue tighter. Tobias turned a page. "Would you mind explaining then this email you sent last November to your husband?" He held the paper high enough for the judge to see. "We need to bury her for good. Make sure nothing traces back to me." A murmur rippled across the gallery. Sabrina froze, the tissue falling to her lap. "That's not what It's in your words, Mrs. Elwood," Tobias interrupted, his tone like a knife sliding between ribs. "Shall I read the rest?" The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening. Sabrina's mouth opened then closed again. Tobias dropped the email onto the evidence cart and lifted another page. "Phone logs," he announced. "Multiple calls made from your residence to county offices, pretending to be Marianne Elwood. Recorded and time-stamped. Would you like to deny those as well?" Sabrina's painted composure shattered. She slumped back into her chair, lips trembling, but no tears came this time. The courtroom clerk called Brian next. His stride to the stand was stiff, his jaw clenched. He answered the first few questions tersely, but as Tobias pressed on, asking about the forged ledger, the frozen accounts, the fraudulent land sale, Brian's control slipped. "Isn't it true you signed a sales contract for property you didn't own?" Tobias asked. Brian's face flushed red. I was told yes or no. Brian slammed his palm on the stand, the sound cracking like a gunshot. Fine, yes, but it was supposed to be mine. Gasps filled the room. The judge banged his gavel for order. Brian's breathing grew ragged, his words tumbling too fast, too raw. She abandoned us. She didn't deserve it. I was just taking what should have been mine. The silence that followed was heavier than the gavel's strike. The judge's voice came low, measured, dangerous. Mr. and Mrs. Elwood, this court does not tolerate weaponizing the legal system for personal vendettas. You've wasted this court's time, defamed your own family, and attempted to manipulate evidence. Sabrina stared at the floor. Brian gripped the rail of the witness box, chest heaving. When the ruling was announced, Tobias didn't flinch. Marianne didn't move. The court fined Brian and Sabrina heavily for filing a malicious suit. The gavel struck, but Marianne was already rising from her chair, stepping out of the courtroom before the echoes faded. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate, her expression unreadable. Behind her, reporters whispered, scribbling notes, but she never looked back. Inside, the judge leaned toward the clerk. Given the scope of these allegations, I'm referring the entire Elwood estate for a full financial audit. The clerk's pen scratched across the order. And outside, as the rain hammered against the courthouse steps, Marianne walked calmly into the storm, knowing the next wave was already forming. The audit began quietly, two accountants, their briefcases clicking shut, entering Elwood Hardware with polite nods. By the third day, the silence broke. Pages of statements, bank transfers, and balance sheets spread across the table like a crime scene photograph. The smell of toner filled the back office, mingling with the metallic tang of unease. Here, one auditor muttered, circling a line with his pen. Funds redirected from the business account, straight into a personal savings account under Brian Elwood's name. The room went still. Tobias leaned in, his lips tightening. How much? The auditor flipped the page. A little over 200,000. It was enough to scorch the entire illusion of stability. News reached Sabrina before it reached the court. She found the email late one night, the pale glow of the monitor casting shadows on her face. Transfer receipts. Dates, amounts. Her stomach dropped with every scroll. 200,000, she whispered to the empty office, her voice shaking. You've been skimming? When Brian walked in moments later, loosening his tie, she shoved the laptop toward him. What the hell is this? His jaw clenched. It's business strategy. No, it's theft, she snapped. You didn't tell me, you didn't tell me. You wouldn't have understood. Brian barked, his voice rising. You're always too cautious. I had to protect us. Sabrina stared at him, her pulse hammering in her ears. For the first time she saw not a partner, but a liability. By the following week, Tobias secured a motion authorizing full recovery of assets on Marianne's behalf. The court order carried weight heavier than any threat. With it, Reggie Lane moved through the hardware store like a man reclaiming stolen ground. The smell of sawdust and rust filled the air as he ripped down shelving, pried up old flooring, and carried out boxes marked inventory hold. Each hammer strike echoed like punctuation to the store's downfall. Marianne stood in the doorway, her coat buttoned against the drizzle, directing with quiet nods. She didn't need to lift a tool. Her authority was built into the walls. On the curtain, Margot watched with her arms crossed, a proud smirk curling her lips. Passers-by slowed to watch as the old Elwood Hardware, Brian's empire, was stripped bare under his mother's command. Inside, Sabrina tried to salvage scraps of control. One late evening, she crept into the gutted aisles, her hands trembling as she stuffed merchandise into canvas bags. The smell of dust choked her as she grabbed whatever she could: power tools, copper wiring, boxes of screws. The whir of a passing patrol car froze her mid-motion. A flashlight beam cut across the parking lot. "Ma'am," an officer's voice called out, sharp. "Step away from the merchandise." Sabrina's bag slipped from her shoulder, the clang of tools spilling across the linoleum. Her scream echoed as she was led out in cuffs, mascara streaking her face like war paint gone wrong. By morning, whispers ran through Salem, Sabrina caught stealing from her own store. Marianne didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The town spoke for her. But the audit hadn't revealed its sharpest knife yet. In a corner of the courthouse basement, an intern working through probate records stumbled across an envelope, thick and sealed, marked in Harold Elwood's hand, last will and testament. It had been misfiled or hidden, with older estate documents. Tobias received the call. Hours later, he placed the envelope on his desk in front of Marianne. "This," he said quietly, "changes everything." Marianne studied the familiar handwriting. Her fingers hovered over the seal, then tore it open. The will was clear, notarized, airtight. Harold had left everything: house, business, savings to Marianne. Sole heir, sole owner, sole protector. Brian and Sabrina had known. They had buried it. For the first time in months, Marianne's lips curved into something colder than a smile. "So they burned the family name," she murmured, "and buried his will with it." Margot exhaled sharply. "But now it's in your hands." The rain hammered harder against the windows, as if applauding the reveal. The family Brian and Sabrina tried to build on lies was collapsing plank by plank, and now Marianne held proof that none of it had ever been theirs to claim. The document lay beneath the courthouse lamp, its seal unbroken until Tobias cut it open with a steady hand. The room smelled of dust and ink, the kind of air that clings to paper meant to last forever. He unfolded the will, each crease sharp, the ink bold despite the years. Harold Elwood's signature glared back at them, crisp and deliberate, witnessed, notarized, undeniable. Tobias read aloud. "I, Harold James Elwood, leave all assets, property, and holdings to my wife Marianne Ruth Elwood. She is sole heir to my estate." Margot let out a breath like she'd been holding it for hours. Reggie leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a rare smile ghosting his lips. Marianne only nodded, her eyes fixed on the page. There was no triumph, no gloating, just the weight of truth pressing down, after years of silence. Within hours, Tobias had filed emergency injunctions on every Elwood asset: hardware store, house, accounts. The courthouse clerks stamped each document with brisk efficiency, the thuds of their stamps sounding like gunshots in the quiet hall. By morning, Brian and Sabrina's world was unraveling. At a deposition, Sabrina sat across from Tobias, her face pale beneath layers of foundation. As the notary pressed record, Tobias slid the authenticated will across the table. Her hand shot to her mouth. That's fake. It's real," Tobias said evenly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Notarized, filed, witnessed. You knew about it." Sabrina's voice cracked. "I didn't." Then louder, shrill, desperate. "I didn't bury anything." He hated her. He hated her. Her chair screeched back as she stood, trembling with fury. Security moved before Tobias even raised a hand, guiding her out as she screamed down the hallway, her words bouncing off sterile walls. Brian didn't scream. He simply stopped showing up. Hearings were scheduled, rescheduled, then abandoned when he failed to appear. His silence was louder than Sabrina's meltdown, the absence of his defense speaking more than his presence ever had. Weeks later, Marianne walked the narrow gravel path to her husband's grave. The cemetery was damp with morning mist, the lake nearby sending a chill through the air. The grass bent under her boots, dew soaking the soles. She stood before the stone, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes dry. The inscription was simple: "Harold J. Elwood, beloved husband and father." "You trusted me," she murmured, her voice low but steady, "even when they didn't." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet cedar. She let the silence stretch, her gaze fixed not on the past but on the ground beneath her feet, the land that was hers now in every sense. When she turned to leave, Tobias was waiting by the gravel drive, a thin envelope in his hand. "This came from a safe deposit box," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of it. Marianne took it. The paper was thick, the handwriting across the front unmistakable. Harold's again. She read the words, her heart thudding once, hard against her ribs. If they ever betray you. The envelope felt heavier than anything she had held before. The bell above the door of Salem's oldest cafe jingled as Marianne stepped inside, the smell of roasted beans and baked cinnamon rolls wrapping around her like an old quilt. Conversations hushed as heads turned. For the first time in years, people didn't avert their eyes when they saw her. They nodded. Some even smiled. At a corner table, the cafe owner, Mrs. Keating, waved her over. "Marianne, sit. Coffee's on me." The warmth of the cup seeped into Marianne's hands. Mrs. Keating leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Words out. You've still got your name on the deeds. Always did. Folks here remember who built that store. It wasn't Brian." Marianne didn't boast. She simply inclined her head. "Then they'll remember where their loyalty belongs." The momentum spread fast. At the auto shop, contracts once tied to Brian quietly shifted back toward Marianne. The stationery store down the block renewed their supplier agreements with her signature. At the farmer's market, vendors nodded at her with a respect that had been withheld for years. By the end of the week, her name was back in circulation, not whispered with pity, but spoken with confidence. Brian and Sabrina, meanwhile, couldn't step out without feeling the town's eyes on them. At the grocery store, Sabrina reached for a basket only for a clerk to mutter, "Thieves don't get credit here." At the gas station, Brian swiped his card, and the attendant deliberately took his time, filling the tank with an air of contempt. Even the casual wave of a neighbor, once friendly, turned into a cold glance. The Elwood's empire hadn't only cracked, it had soured in the public eye. Margot saw the tide shifting and decided to mark it. She organized a small ceremony at the public library, a building that smelled of paper and rain-soaked totes, its meeting hall filled with folding chairs and yellow lamplight. Flyers had been posted discreetly, but by evening the room was packed. On stage, a table held a framed photograph of Harold Elwood at the ribbon cutting of the hardware store decades earlier. Next to it, Margot placed a vase of fresh lilies. When she introduced Marianne, the room erupted in applause, not loud, but steady, like the acknowledgement of something long overdue. Marianne stepped up to the lectern. She wore her simple navy coat, her hair pinned back. Her voice carried through the hall, calm and measured. "I never thought I'd be standing here again speaking to you," she began. "For years I kept quiet. I thought silence was the safest path, but silence can be stolen, twisted, and used against you. My husband and I built Elwood Hardware as a promise to this town that families could depend on us, that we'd never cheat the hands that keep Salem standing." Her gaze swept the crowd. "I may have been cast out, but I was never gone, and I won't be erased." Applause thundered louder this time, echoing through the rafters. Marianne stepped back, not smiling, but her shoulders eased in a way they hadn't in months. The following Sunday, the Statesman Journal hit the stands with a front-page exposé. The Elwood fraud, forgery, hidden wills, and a family divided. The article laid bare everything: fraudulent signatures, misappropriated funds, even Sabrina's late-night theft attempt. Beneath the headline was a photo of Marianne taken candidly at the courthouse steps, her expression steady, almost spectral. Copies sold out within hours. Salem had its story and its villain and its survivor. But just as the town's loyalty solidified, the law tightened its grip. Late one afternoon, blue and red lights reflected across the rain-slicked windows of Elwood Hardware. A pair of officers stepped inside, their boots squeaking on the linoleum. "Brian Elwood?" one asked. Brian looked up from the counter, his face drained of color. "You're under arrest for wire fraud," the officer said, reading from the warrant. "Funds misappropriated from the employee retirement account." Gasps echoed from the few remaining customers. Sabrina's face crumpled, her lipstick smudged as she whispered, "No, no, no." Handcuffs clicked shut. The sound was final, metallic, undeniable, and across town, in the warm lamplight of her kitchen, Marianne closed her journal and underlined her last note of the day. The town has chosen. The closed sign came down from the window of Elwood Hardware on a misty Monday morning. In its place, a fresh sheet of paper, hand-lettered by Marianne herself, read reopening soon under new management. The townspeople noticed. By the end of the week, the windows no longer bore the grime of neglect. The old logo had been scraped off, and the front facade was being stripped of its tired siding. Reggie swung a hammer with steady precision, the smell of fresh paint already clinging to his jacket. Every board he pulled away carried traces of Brian cheap signage, rushed repairs, shortcuts taken. Each one was discarded in a growing pile at the curb. "Feels good," he muttered, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. Marianne stood nearby, arms folded, her expression unreadable but firm. "Strip it clean," she told him. "Not one piece of their name stays." By the time the new signage went up, plain dignified lettering reading Marianne's Supply and Trade, the store looked unrecognizable. It was hers again, and this time, unmistakably so. Sabrina, meanwhile, was unraveling. In a cramped bank office, she jabbed her ID across the counter, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the glass partition. "I need access to the joint business account," she insisted. The teller typed briefly, then frowned. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Elwood. Your access has been revoked." "Court order." "What do you mean revoked?" Her voice rose, trembling. "That money's mine." The teller glanced uneasily at the line forming behind her. "Not anymore." Sabrina's nails screeched across the glass as she snatched her ID back, her chest heaving. Back at Tobias's office, Marianne signed the final pages of 2 lawsuits, defamation suits, each addressed to Brian and Sabrina. Her pen strokes were steady, decisive. "They dragged my name through the mud," she said softly, handing the papers back. "Now they'll choke on their own words." Tobias nodded, his sharp eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "They wanted to bury you in lies. Let the truth be their coffin." By the grand reopening, the community poured back through the doors. The smell of sawdust mixed with brewing coffee, an addition Marianne insisted on, and shelves gleamed with fresh stock. Families who had once avoided the store returned in steady waves, shaking Marianne's hand, clapping Reggie on the shoulder, and murmuring words like "about time" and "should have been yours all along." Even Margot, usually reserved, stood near the register, beaming as she helped pass out cookies to customers. The hum of voices filled the air, replacing years of tension with the sound of revival. That evening, after the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Tobias entered with a final set of papers. He placed them on the counter, his tone reverent. "It's done. Every property, every asset consolidated under your sole trust. Nothing they touch remains theirs." Marianne looked down at the neat stack of documents, her name printed bold on each page. Ownership restored. Legacy untangled. But Tobias wasn't finished. He slid a smaller envelope from his briefcase, aged and brittle, its edges yellowed with time. "This was found with the other deposit record," he said. "I don't think they ever knew it existed." Marianne turned it over, her breath slowing as she read the handwriting across the front. "Harold's again." Her fingers worked carefully at the seal, until the flap gave. Inside was a single deed, stamped and notarized. She scanned the address. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the store. It was another property entirely. A cabin by the lake. Her pulse quickened for the first time in months. Harold had left her something more, something hidden. She closed the envelope with deliberate care, her eyes narrowing. "If they thought I was finished," she murmured, "they haven't seen what's next." The cabin sat on the edge of Silverton Lake, swallowed by fog and silence. Moss crept up its stone chimney, shingles curled from decades of neglect. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that carried memory in its bones. Marianne stepped from her car, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. She stood at the water's edge, the cabin reflected in ripples that distorted its broken windows and sagging porch. For years, it had waited, forgotten by Brian, hidden from Sabrina, left untouched, until now. She approached the door. The lock resisted, but one of the old keys from her ring slid in, catching with a click. The hinges groaned as she pushed it open, the smell of dust and mildew flooding out. Inside, sunlight filtered through slats and fractured patterns across warped floorboards. A fishing rod leaned forgotten in the corner, and on the mantel sat a cracked photo frame, Harold, younger, smiling at a trout bigger than his forearm. Marianne's hand brushed over the frame. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "You meant this for me," she whispered. By week's end, Reggie was hauling out rotted beams and broken furniture. The buzz of his saw carried across the water, mingling with the cries of distant loons. Marianne directed every change: fresh siding, new windows, a roof strong enough to outlast storms. The scent of cut cedar filled the air, slowly replacing the stench of rot. "This place will breathe again," Reggie said, wiping sweat from his brow. Marianne nodded, her gaze steady on the horizon. It was never dead, just waiting. Meanwhile, Tobias finalized the trust. He laid the finished documents before her in his office, his tone sharp and deliberate. "Everything is in your name, Marianne. The trust is impenetrable. No court, no creditor, no family can touch it." She signed the last page with a pen that didn't shake. Then it sealed. "I carry it all now." While she restored, Brian and Sabrina collapsed. Their accounts frozen, their assets seized, lawsuits stacked higher than their lawyer's briefcase could carry. They lurked at the edges of Salem now, Sabrina avoiding eye contact at bus stops, Brian slumping out of pawn shops with a hollow stare. They had gambled everything, and lost. Marianne stripped their name from her new world piece by piece. The hardware store sign came down again, this time replaced with one that bore no trace of Elwood. Contracts, bank accounts, and business licenses, all refiled, all scrubbed clean. Elwood was gone. Marianne remained. On a cold October morning, Reggie hammered the final screws into a bronze plaque on the restored cabin's porch. The words gleamed against the cedar siding, "Rebuilt by the Forgotten." Margot stood beside Marianne, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, pride sparking in her eyes. "That's exactly what you are to them," she said quietly. "Forgotten. But here you are." Marianne's gaze lingered on the plaque. "Ghosts don't disappear," she said. "They wait, and they haunt." But she wasn't finished haunting. Not yet. Tobias returned weeks later with one final set of papers. They weren't deeds or injunctions. They were instructions, drafted at her request. He hesitated before handing them over. "Are you sure?" Marianne took them without pause. The new estate, the cabin, the store, the assets would not flow to Brian, not even to distant relatives. Her signature gave it all to Salem itself: community projects, scholarships, restoration grants. She had clawed her life back, only to give it away on her own terms. The Elwood bloodline would inherit nothing. The town would inherit everything. And in that choice, she became more than a name. She became the ghost that outlived them. The line outside the newly christened Salem Supply Co-op stretched down the block on opening day. The air smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, and roasted coffee drifting from a cart Reggie had set up by the entrance. A new sign hung proudly above the door. Not Elwood, not any name tainted by theft, just clean block letters declaring a beginning that belonged solely to Marianne. Inside, workers bustled with purpose. Contracts weren't about ownership anymore, they were about partnership. Every employee was now a shareholder in the co-op, their voices tied to the future of the store. Marianne moved quietly among them, checking the shelves, pausing to greet familiar faces. A young clerk stopped her at the register. "Mrs. Elwood." "Sorry, Marianne," the clerk corrected, cheeks flushing. "It feels different in here. Like it's ours too." Marianne only nodded. "That's the point." Weeks later, the first press release for the Harold Elwood Trade Fund hit the local papers. The fund would provide scholarships for Salem students entering technical schools, electricians, welders, mechanics. Marianne insisted Harold's name front it, not hers. He'd want kids to have the chance to build something with their hands, she told Tobias. The announcement spread through town like a warm current. Guidance counselors called parents. Teachers clipped the article to bulletin boards. For the first time, Harold's name was spoken not as the man Brian tried to erase, but as the benefactor of a future generation. At the library, Margot unpacked the first shipment of new books purchased by a grant funded from the reclaimed estate. The smell of fresh ink and binding glue filled the stacks as she shelved them herself. Children ran their hands across glossy covers, their laughter echoing beneath the high arched ceiling. She looked up to see Marianne in the doorway, watching quietly. Margot's voice carried across the aisle. "You've given them something no one can repossess." Meanwhile, the ones who had tried to take everything were unraveling. On a gray afternoon, Sabrina stood at the corner of Liberty and State, her hair matted from drizzle, a cardboard sign trembling in her hands. "Need help. Anything helps." People passed without slowing. A man dropped coins in her cup without looking at her face. Marianne, carrying a bag of groceries, crossed the same street. Her gaze flicked to Sabrina once, unreadable, before she walked past. She didn't pause, didn't speak, didn't pity. The silence was sharper than any insult. Back at the co-op, Reggie hammered a small nail into the wall behind the register. In his hand was a crisp dollar bill, the first earned under the store's new name. He framed it carefully, adjusting until it sat straight. "First dollar," he said, stepping back. His grin stretched wide, but his eyes glistened. Marianne studied the frame, her expression cool but steady. "Not the first I've ever earned," she said softly, "but the first that can't be stolen." That night, Tobias arrived at the cabin by the lake. The fireplace crackled, filling the air with the scent of pine resin. He carried a leather portfolio, heavier than usual. He set it on the table and opened it with deliberate care. The last deed slid free, its edges still crisp. His voice was calm but final. "Everything they touched is yours now." The flames popped in the hearth. Marianne rested her hand on the paper, feeling its weight, its permanence, but her mind was already on what came next. The lake was still that morning, a gray sheet of water breathing fog into the air. From the porch of the restored cabin, Marianne sat wrapped in a wool blanket, the steam of her coffee curling into the mist. The wood beneath her chair creaked softly, the only sound breaking the hush of dawn. Every corner of this cabin had been reclaimed, the cedar scent of freshly sanded walls, the faint crackle of a fire still glowing from last night, the clean order of tools lined along the wall. Once abandoned, once hidden, it was now a sanctuary. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Margot stepped in, her cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a thermos of hot cider and a bundle of folded newspapers tied with string. "Thought you'd want to see how history remembers you," she said. Marianne untied the bundle. Spreading the clippings across the table, headlines spilled out. Elwood fraud scandal. Community revives through co-op. Trade fund launches first scholarships. Her name threaded through each article, not as a ghost anymore, but as a cornerstone. "They got it wrong in some details," Margot muttered, pouring cider into mugs. "But the truth's there. They'll never erase it again." Marianne traced a fingertip along the edge of one clipping, her face unreadable. "They don't have to get it perfect," she said quietly. "They just have to remember who kept standing." Later that afternoon, Reggie arrived, his boots muddy, a grin lighting his face despite the drizzle. He carried a folder thick with invoices and receipts. "The store's broken profit records," he announced. "First time in its history." Marianne didn't rise, but her eyes lifted to his, steady and approving. "Good. Make sure the first thing you buy is more shelving. If we're growing, we're not slowing." Reggie laughed, setting the folder down. On his way out, he paused, glancing back at her. "It's different now, Marianne. People walk in because of you. They're proud to say they belong to that store." The words lingered long after his footsteps faded down the porch steps. As twilight sank, Tobias's letter arrived by courier, sealed in a crisp envelope. She read it by lamplight. All cases are closed. All assets are secured in your trust. The law has no more claims on you. It's finished. For the first time, Marianne let the letter sit on her lap without moving. Finished. A word she had waited years to hear, but not everything was finished. On the mantel sat another envelope, Brian's final letter. It had arrived weeks ago. His handwriting shaky, the paper smudged. She hadn't opened it. She never would. Marianne lifted it now, the firelight flickering across her face, without breaking the seal. She tossed it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. His words would never find her ears. She turned back to the porch, where a small block of cedar wood waited on her workbench. Taking up her carving knife, she worked slowly, the blade whispering through the grain. Each cut was deliberate, each letter precise. When she was done, she held up the sign, the words etched deep. Peace kept, not given. She hung it by the door, the wood still warm from her hands. The fog rolled heavier over the lake, cloaking the water in silence. Marianne settled back into her chair, her breath steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. They said I was gone, she whispered to the air, her voice calm, absolute, but I never left. I just came back as everything they couldn't touch.